The man was officially missing, but 3 days after he vanished, his signature appeared on a municipal ledger I was holding in my hands. The ink was fresh, the date was current, and the account it authorized had just paid out another $32,000. That was the moment I understood something was deeply wrong, because people don't disappear and keep doing their jobs. It was late October when the call reached me, the kind of evening when the rain doesn't fall so much as linger, hanging in the air like a bad memory. I was living alone by then, retired, doing my best to stay out of other people's problems. The year was 1989. I remember because the radiator in my apartment had started knocking again, and I'd been meaning to fix it for 3 winters straight. The phone rang once, stopped, then rang again. That second ring told me it mattered. The woman on the line introduced herself as Eleanor Price. Her voice was steady, but steadiness can be a learned thing. Said her husband, Martin Price, had gone missing 3 days earlier. Martin was the senior municipal accountant for a small coastal town called Greyhaven. Not the kind of place you stumble into by accident. You either grew up there, or you had a reason to stay. Eleanor said the local police were handling it, which usually meant they'd asked a few polite questions and were waiting for the problem to solve itself. I told her I was retired. She said she knew. She said that was why she was calling. Greyhaven sat 4 hours north, tucked between the ocean and a line of tired pine forests. I drove up the next morning under a sky the color of old steel. The road was slick, the kind that reflects headlights back at you like it's judging your decisions. By the time I reached the town limits, the rain had settled into a steady rhythm, tapping against the windshield like fingers on a desk. The place looked exactly how you'd expect. Low buildings, faded signage, a diner with one flickering neon letter, wet asphalt glowing under yellow streetlights. I parked near the municipal building and sat there for a moment, watching people move with their heads down, collars up, like the weather had taught them not to look around too much. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old coffee. Eleanor was waiting for me in a narrow office that still had typewriters on half the desks. She stood when I entered. No tears, just tired eyes and hands folded too tightly together. She told me Martin had left for work on Monday morning and never came home. No note, no packed bag. His car was still in the driveway. His coat was still on the hook. "What do the police think?" I asked. She hesitated just long enough to matter. "They think he ran." People don't usually run without their coats in October. They don't leave behind bank accounts, toothbrushes, and spouses they've been married to for 22 years. But I didn't say that yet. I asked where Martin worked. She pointed across the street. The municipal finance office was quiet in the way only government buildings can be. Empty desks, buzzing lights, footsteps echoing down hallways that had heard the same sounds for decades. A man named Deputy Clerk Wallace showed me Martin's office. Everything was neat, too neat, files aligned, pens placed parallel, no signs of panic, no overturned drawers, just absence. On Martin's desk sat a ledger. I didn't touch it at first. I've learned that the things people leave behind usually say more than what they take with them. Wallace cleared his throat and said they'd already checked everything. I nodded and thanked him. He left quickly, like the room made him uncomfortable. I opened the ledger. Most of it was routine: dates, numbers, transfers. Then I noticed something small. An entry dated 2 days after Martin disappeared. Same handwriting, same signature. I checked the date again, then the ink. Still dark, still fresh. Stay with me until the end. The truth behind this case still unsettles me. I closed the book and felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The feeling you get when the pieces don't just fail to fit, they actively resist each other. I'd seen forged signatures before, plenty of them. But this wasn't rushed. It wasn't sloppy. Whoever wrote it knew exactly how Martin Price wrote his name. Before I tell you what happened next, please consider subscribing. It truly helps keep these stories alive. Outside, the rain had picked up. I walked the length of Main Street, letting the town show itself to me. A bar with steamed-up windows. A hardware store closing early. People who glanced at me just long enough to register I didn't belong. Greyhaven felt calm, but it was the kind of calm you get after something heavy has been pushed under the surface. I stopped at the diner. Coffee there tasted like it had been reheated too many times, but it was hot, and that counted for something. The waitress said, "Martin Price used to come in every Thursday at exactly 8:10 a.m. Same booth, same order, black coffee, no sugar. He hadn't missed a Thursday in 11 years, until now." What would you have done in my place? Back at my motel, I spread out what little I had. Timeline, habits. That ledger entry kept staring back at me. A man doesn't vanish and continue authorizing municipal payments. Either Martin wasn't missing, or someone wanted it to look like he wasn't. The next morning I paid a visit to the local police station. Small place. 2 desks, one holding cell that smelled like bleach and resignation. The chief, a man named Rourke, listened politely while telling me nothing useful. He said Martin had access to sensitive accounts. He said stress did things to people. He said the town was cooperating. People who say they're cooperating usually aren't. On my way out, I noticed a bulletin board near the records room. Pinned notices, old flyers, a typed memo about delayed insurance, payouts tied to a maritime incident from years back. The date caught my eye. So did the signature at the bottom, Martin Price. I stepped back into the rain with more questions than answers and that uneasy sense that I wasn't chasing a man anymore. I was chasing a system. And systems don't like being looked at too closely. What would you have done in my place? By the end of that first day, I knew 2 things for certain. Martin Price hadn't simply disappeared, and whatever had taken his place was still very much at work. The second day in Greyhaven started the same way the first one ended, with rain pressed flat against the streets and a feeling that I was already behind. I don't like that feeling. It means someone else is setting the pace, and I'm just reacting. I began where the ledger had pointed me, the insurance payouts tied to that old maritime incident. The clerk's office was quiet, even for a weekday morning. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, paper dust hung in the air. A woman named Sandra Holt handled records requests, mid-40s, careful eyes, the kind of person who remembers who touches which file. I asked about the incident. She told me it was a ferry grounding back in '76. No fatalities, minor injuries, a write-off officially, but the payouts told a different story. Small monthly disbursements that never quite stopped, names repeated, addresses unchanged for decades. What would you have done in my place? Sandra hesitated when I asked who approved the extensions. Then she said what everyone in Greyhaven seemed to say when the questions got uncomfortable. Martin handled that. I asked her if she'd seen him recently. She said no, then corrected herself. She'd spoken to him last week over the phone. He'd sounded tired, distracted. She remembered because he'd asked her to resend a document he already had. That made two things Martin had done after he vanished. Outside, the rain had turned heavier, flattening cigarette butts into the gutter. I walked 2 blocks to the harbor office. Greyhaven's port wasn't much. A few trawlers, a rusted crane, wood pilings eaten thin by salt. The harbor master, a man named Lewis Crane, looked at me like I was tracking mud onto his floor. Crane told me the ferry grounding had been exaggerated at the time. Town needed the money, he said, not even lowering his voice. State funds were easier back then. Less oversight. He said Martin had known. More than known. He'd maintained the flow, kept the paperwork clean, smoothed the edges when auditors asked questions. And now? I asked. Crane shrugged. Now it's messy. I left with a copy of the original incident report. Half of it was redacted. The rest was vague to the point of uselessness, but the signatures were consistent. Same approval chain, same quiet cooperation. Back at my motel, I spread the papers across the bed. Rain streaked down the window, blurring the parking lot into a watercolor of dull reds and yellows. Patterns started to form. Not a conspiracy, those tend to be loud and sloppy, but an understanding. A long-standing agreement that nobody talked about because everyone benefited. I went back out after dark. Greyhaven looked different at night. Streetlights threw long reflections across wet asphalt. Neon from the bar smeared red across the sidewalk. Footsteps echoed too clearly in empty streets. I was halfway down Main when I noticed a car idling across the street. Engine running, lights off. When I stopped, it stopped. When I crossed, it pulled away slow, like it didn't want to be noticed. I don't believe in coincidence, especially not quiet ones. What would you have done in my place? The next lead came from a mistake. Mine. I trusted the wrong person. Deputy Clerk Wallace called me back to the municipal building after hours, said he'd found something I should see. His voice was nervous, rushed. The building was mostly dark, one hallway lit. Wallace stood outside Martin's office, hands shaking just enough to notice. He showed me a file marked closed. Inside were death benefit records, veterans, dock workers, a few names I recognized from the insurance lists. These people aren't dead, Wallace whispered. I already knew that. What I didn't know was that the file was gone when I returned the next morning. Wallace wouldn't meet my eyes, said he'd misunderstood, said maybe I'd imagined it. Someone had gotten to him. On my way out, I felt it again, that pressure between the shoulder blades that says you're being watched. I didn't turn around. I let the rain do its thing. Reflections, distortions. Everyone looks guilty in water and light. That night, my motel room phone rang once, then again. No one spoke, just breathing, calm, patient. After this, there was no turning back for me. The third day brought a new name, Federal Audit Liaison, a man who'd passed through Greyhaven twice in 10 years and never stayed long enough to get a coffee. His reports were clean, too clean. I tracked him down through an old contact. The meeting took place in a parking garage 2 towns over, concrete walls dripping from the storm. He didn't deny it. Said the town was self-correcting. Said exposure would collapse pensions, livelihoods, families. Said Martin Price had understood that. Then why disappear? I asked. The man didn't answer. He just looked at the ground like it might offer forgiveness. What would you have done in my place? By then, I could feel the edges closing in. Doors that had been open were quietly shut. Calls went unanswered. Files were suddenly misplaced. Someone wanted this to end, and they weren't subtle about it anymore. Late that night, back in my room, I reviewed the ledger again. The last entry, the one after Martin vanished. I noticed something new, a timing irregularity. The authorization came in minutes after a storm-related power outage had knocked out half the town. Someone had been waiting. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about hiding money. It was about control, about keeping a system alive long after it should have collapsed under its own weight. And Martin Price? He hadn't run. He'd stepped out of sight and left the machine running. I sat there listening to the rain drum against the window, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, and realized something else just as unsettling. If I kept going, I wasn't just investigating a disappearance. I was threatening an entire town's way of surviving, and towns, like people, don't give that up without a fight. By the fourth day, Greyhaven had stopped pretending I wasn't there. Doors still opened, but slower. Conversations didn't end when I entered. They thinned, like fog burned off by a weak sun. People were watching me now, not with anger, but calculation. The way you look at a loose thread you're afraid to pull. I started with the power outage. Storm-related, they'd said. A transformer down by the docks. Convenient timing. I went to the utility office just after dawn, rain still clinging to the town like it didn't know where else to go. The supervisor, a heavy-set man with nicotine-stained fingers, showed me the logs. The outage had lasted exactly 11 minutes, long enough to shut down terminals, long enough to erase timestamps, long enough to reroute authority if you knew how. What would you have done in my place? The authorization from Martin's account came through during mine at 7. That meant someone was already logged in, waiting. I walked the harbor after that. Fog rolled in off the water, thick and low, swallowing the ends of the piers. The trawlers knocked softly against their moorings, ropes creaking like tired joints. I stopped by the rusted crane and watched gulls circle with no interest in landing. This was where the ferry had run aground in '76, officially a mechanical failure. Unofficially, a mess that had paid dividends for decades. A man named Calder found me there. Early '60s. Dock supervisor back when the grounding happened. He didn't introduce himself. Just stood beside me, hands in his pockets, staring at the water. You won't find him, he said. Find who? I asked. Martin. That was the first time anyone had said his name without being prompted. Calder told me Martin had come down to the docks the week before he disappeared. Walked the length of the pier. Asked about old logs, old repairs. Asked who still remembered the night the ferry hit bottom. What would you have done in my place? He said something else, Calder went on. Said systems don't die. They just change hands. Then Calder left, boots echoing down the boards, swallowed by fog. That afternoon the pressure shifted. My motel room had been turned over. Not ransacked, searched. Clothes folded differently. Papers moved, then put back just close enough to be insulting. The ledger was still there. That surprised me. It was a message. We're watching. We're not afraid. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the room settle back into itself. Cigarette smoke drifted up toward the yellowed ceiling. I thought about Martin Price. about what kind of man becomes the spine of a town's quiet corruption. Not greedy, not reckless, just precise. The key came from a place I hadn't looked hard enough yet. Eleanor Price. I'd avoided her after the first day, not out of suspicion, out of habit. Families complicate things, but that evening I went back to the house. Lights were on, curtains drawn. The rain had eased into a fine mist, coating everything in a dull shine. Eleanor answered the door without surprise. "You figured something out," she said. Inside, the house smelled like lemon cleaner and old books, everything in its place. Too controlled. She made tea, hand steady, no tremor. That mattered. I asked her when she'd last spoken to Martin. She told me the same story again. Monday morning. Kiss goodbye. No call after. Then I asked her about the phone records. Her eyes shifted, just slightly. "What would you have done in my place?" I told her about the calls Martin had made after he disappeared, about Sandra Holt, about the authorization during the outage. I told her I didn't think Martin was dead. Eleanor didn't react the way people usually do when you say something like that. No relief. No shock. Just a slow exhale. "He said this might happen," she said quietly. She went to a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. Martin's handwriting. Tight. Organized. Dates. Names. Cross-references. Not incriminating on its own, but damning in context. "He told me if he ever vanished," she said, "it meant the town had finally started to eat itself." The notebook outlined everything I'd been circling. Insurance loops, false deaths, veterans who'd moved away but never been declared alive. A closed ecosystem of money and silence, and at the center of it, Martin. Not as the architect, as the caretaker. "He was tired," Eleanor said. "He said holding it together was getting harder, that people were getting careless." I asked her where he was. She shook her head. "He didn't tell me. He said if I knew it would put me in danger." That was when I understood the shape of it. Martin hadn't disappeared to escape. He'd disappeared to remove the keystone, to see what would happen if the system lost its stabilizer, if fear replaced routine. What would you have done in my place? That night, the investigation nearly collapsed. Someone tipped off the state auditors. Files were seized, accounts frozen. The town hall buzzed like a kicked hive. People shouted. Accusations flew. Old alliances cracked under the weight of panic. And in the middle of it all, a man tried to kill me. Not dramatically. No alleyway ambush. Just a car that didn't slow at a crosswalk. Headlights off, engine screaming. I jumped back, felt the heat of it pass close enough to steal breath. The car never stopped. I stood there in the rain, heart hammering, and felt something else settle in. Resolve. The next morning, I followed the final thread. An abandoned boathouse at the far end of the harbor. Power line spliced illegally. Generator humming low. Inside, papers spread across a folding table. Radios, timers, logs, and Martin Price, alive, thinner, older, but calm. He didn't look surprised to see me. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. We talked for a long time. No shouting, no confession, just explanation. He told me he'd designed the disappearance to force exposure, to make the town choose between saving itself honestly or tearing itself apart, trying to hide. "I didn't expect you," he admitted. "But maybe I needed you." "What would you have done in my place?" he asked me. That was the hardest question of all, because standing there, listening to the rain drum on the tin roof, I realized the truth wasn't clean. There was no way to pull it out without cutting deep. and whatever I chose next wouldn't just end a case, it would end a town as it knew itself. When I left the boathouse, the fog had lifted just enough to show Greyhaven's lights reflected in the water. Beautiful, fragile, built on something rotten. And for the first time since I arrived, I understood why Martin had stepped into the shadows. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting to see who would blink first. I didn't arrest Martin Price. I didn't shake his hand either. We stood there in that boathouse, rain ticking softly on the corrugated roof, the generator humming like a tired animal, and let the truth settle between us. He wasn't hiding from the law. He was hiding from inevitability, delaying it just long enough to force everyone else to show their cards. People think corruption starts loud, Martin said. It doesn't. It starts tidy. He walked me through it slowly, methodically. The ferry grounding had been the seed. Federal money flowed in fast, oversight thin. One exception became two. Two became routine. Over the years, the town learned what could be bent without breaking. Martin inherited the system from a predecessor who'd died quietly and comfortably, praised as a public servant. Martin never stole for himself. That was the part that unsettled me most. He managed the flow, kept it balanced, kept everyone just comfortable enough not to panic. When auditors came, he redirected attention. When numbers drifted, he corrected them. When someone died or moved away, the paperwork lagged, just long enough. What would you have done in my place? The ledger entries after his disappearance weren't mistakes or forgeries. They were delayed authorizations he'd queued in advance, knowing the outage would give him cover. The phone calls were routed through an old switching system the town still used. Greyhaven was behind the times in all the ways that mattered. You wanted it to unravel, I said. He nodded. But on its own, I needed to know what kind of place it really was. We went over names. The harbor master, the clerk, the doctor who signed off on injuries that never quite healed, the federal liaison who looked the other way because exposure would mean answering questions about his own reports. None of them were masterminds, just participants, people who told themselves they were keeping the town alive. By the time I left the boathouse, the decision was already forming. Not justice, consequence. There's a difference. Justice is clean. Consequence is what actually happens. I drove straight to the state capitol, didn't call ahead, didn't warn anyone. I handed over everything: ledgers, notebooks, copies of communications, timelines. I didn't mention Martin's location. Not yet. I told them where to look instead. Greyhaven imploded, quietly. Accounts were frozen, emergency audits initiated. State investigators arrived with boxes and badges and that particular brand of politeness that means someone's life is about to change. The town hall stayed lit late into the night. Phones rang without answers. People stopped meeting each other's eyes. Back in Greyhaven, I watched from a distance. The diner closed for renovations. The harbor office shuttered. The bar kept its neon on, but fewer people went inside. Those insurance payments stopped. So did the silence. Lawsuits followed, then indictments. Not dramatic ones, just enough to fracture the illusion. What would you have done in my place? Eleanor Price called me once. Just once. She said Martin had left town. She didn't ask where. She didn't want to know. She thanked me, not for saving him, but for ending it. Her voice sounded lighter, sad, but lighter. The chief of police resigned. The deputy clerk transferred. The federal liaison disappeared into a consulting job in another state. No one went to prison for life. No one got away clean either. That's usually how it goes. As for Martin, he surfaced briefly months later, turned himself in quietly in another jurisdiction, took a plea, gave testimony. He looked smaller in the photos, relieved maybe, or just done. I testified too, not about heroics, about numbers, about timing, about how systems rot when enough people agree not to look too closely. The prosecutors liked that. It made the case simple. Afterward, I went back to the harbor one last time. Fog rolled in off the water, swallowing the lights one by one. The boathouse was dark, the generator gone. The town looked smaller without its secrets propping it up. I stood there longer than I needed to. What would you have done in my place? There's a belief that truth sets things right. I don't buy that anymore. Truth just removes the lies. What people do after that is on them. Greyhaven didn't die. Not exactly. It changed. People left. Others stayed. The town learned how to live without the quiet subsidy of dishonesty. It hurt. It always does. I drove away before dawn, wet asphalt glowing behind me, streetlights fading in the rearview mirror. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd finished something that should have ended years earlier. Some cases stay with you because they're violent, others because they're personal. This one stayed because everyone involved thought they were doing the least wrong thing available. And that, I've learned, is how most damage gets done. I didn't return to Greyhaven for a long time after that. Towns like that don't need witnesses once the dust settles. They need time. And even then, time doesn't fix much. It just makes the damage easier to live with. The official consequences came in waves. First the audits, then the charges. Mostly financial crimes, conspiracy, fraud, a few quiet plea deals that never made the evening news. The kind of justice that wears a suit and avoids eye contact. Some people lost jobs. A few lost pensions. One man I'd spoken to early on moved away in the middle of the night and never came back. Another drank himself into a hospital bed before spring. Greyhaven stayed on the map, but it shrank. Businesses closed, the harbor thinned out, federal money dried up, replaced by something harder, honesty. That kind of adjustment hurts. People don't thank you for it. I was called to testify once more, months later. Windowless room, long table, coffee that tasted like cardboard. They asked me if I thought Martin Price was a criminal or a whistleblower. I told them he was an accountant who carried a town on his back for too long and eventually decided to put it down. They didn't like that answer. Martin served time. Not much, considering the scope of it all. He cooperated fully, gave names, explained methods, never raised his voice, never defended himself. When I saw him one last time in that sterile corridor, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with prison. I just wanted it to stop, he said. I believed him. Eleanor sent me a short letter after the sentencing. No return address, no bitterness. Just a few lines saying she'd sold the house and moved closer to her sister. She said she slept better now, even if the nights were quieter than she'd expected. That stuck with me. I've worked murders where the lines were clearer. Blood on the floor. A body that told you when things went wrong. This case didn't have that. No single violent moment, no clean villain, just years of small decisions stacked on top of each other until the weight crushed everyone underneath. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd walked away early. If I'd told Eleanor I was too old, too tired, too finished, the town would have limped along a little longer. The money would have kept flowing. The silence would have held. But the rot would have spread. I learned something from Greyhaven that stayed with me into retirement. People don't usually destroy things out of greed or hatred. They do it out of fear. Fear of change, fear of loss, fear of being the one who finally says no. I still walk at night sometimes. Old habit, wet pavement, yellow street lights, reflections tremblin' in puddles. When the world goes quiet like that, it's easier to hear what you've been carrying. That case taught me that truth doesn't arrive like a rescue. It arrives like a reckoning. And when it doesn't ask who's ready. It just shows up. And what's the strangest case you ever heard of? I'd like to read your stories in the comments.